Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, Associate Professor of Communication at Lund University. Remember, you can follow the show on X at SMNP Podcast, or visit us on the web at socialmediaandpolitics.org. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for tuning in. In this episode, we're going to be focusing on young people and their political expression on social media, which I think is a really timely topic because barely an election goes by these days without some reporting of, how will young people affect this election? And what that discourse is implying is how will young people vote in a way that affects the election results? But there are many young people who are under the legal voting age in their respective countries who are still expressing political opinions on social media and often in very unconventional and creative ways. And so the question is, how do we make sense of these expressions, whether they are TikTok videos or Instagram campaigns? What can this tell us about what citizenship is today? And how can we use these expressions to somehow assess the quality of democracy? And my guests to discuss this today are Dr. Neta Kligler-Vilenchik and Dr. Ioana Literat, who together have authored the book Not Your Parents' Politics: Understanding Young People's Political Expression on Social Media, which is published by Oxford University Press. So we're going to have two guests on today's episode. And Dr. Kligler-Vilenchik is Associate Professor of Communication and Journalism at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, whereas Dr. Literat is Associate Professor in the Communication, Media, and Learning Technologies Design program at the Teachers College at Columbia University. And what I really like about this book is the argument that even though young people may not be old enough to vote, we should still look at their social media expressions because this is a way that young people are finding their political voice. They're experimenting with their civic identity so that later, when they are fully fledged citizens in the administrative sense, their political identities are formed at an early age through their peer-to-peer interactions on social media and the type of feedback they get, and importantly, how both their communication and the feedback is mediated by different platforms. So in the book, Dr. Kligler-Vilenchik and Dr. Literat look at three case studies, one being Musical.ly, which was the precursor to TikTok, and the 2016 election campaign in the US, so a very sort of partisan election study on Musical.ly and how young people are commenting on politics there, as well as Black Lives Matter on Instagram and climate anxiety on YouTube. So we'll briefly walk through those case studies, but also keep more of a theoretical focus on what does young people's political expression on social media mean for democracy? How can we make sense of this? Because if you think about social media and all the content you see on there, it is just a form of communication. And therefore, how do we think about that type of communication in broader models of citizenship, which classic political science would put mostly in the realm of actions and activities, where this is pure communication? And when it comes from people who are not old enough to vote, how can we make sense of that in a broader democratic context? So without further ado, let me turn it over to Dr. Neta Kligler-Vilenchik and Dr. Ioana Literat. Again, they are the authors of the book Not Your Parents' Politics. Dr. Kligler-Vilenchik, Dr. Literat, thanks so much for taking the time out and welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So let's set the stage here with what you describe as a moral panic surrounding social media and young people. On the one hand, we see governments and tech companies increasingly taking steps to limit young people's access to social media or limit access to certain features on social media. But on the other hand, you argue that unconventional forms of expression help young people to experiment with their political voice in their role as democratic citizens. So can you unpack this argument for us? How can expressing political views at a young age be important for developing a civic voice?
Yeah, thanks for this question, Michael. So there's this joke that we mentioned in our book, and it says that psychologists often think that nothing that happens after age 18 matters, whereas political scientists think that nothing that happens before age 18 matters. And I think that joke is relevant to our book and to speaking to a political communication audience, because we sort of ask the question, right? Like when we're 18 and we're a fully fledged citizen who can vote, it's as if we expect 18-year-olds to suddenly have their civic views, to suddenly have their political opinion. But where does this start? Where does this come from? Why do we discount the views and the ideas and the opinions and the thoughts and the perceptions of those who are younger than 18 and who are developing? And so really our starting point is taking seriously the process of political socialization, where by political socialization, we don't mean it just in the traditional sense of top-down socialization, where we see young people as learning politics and learning about civics just from their parents and from maybe their civics class or from the mainstream media. But rather, it's both a horizontal and sometimes a bottom-up form of political socialization, where young people, even as they're just beginning to form their political views and their perceptions about politics, have a lot to contribute. And even sometimes 11-year-olds, we start our book with an example of an 11-year-old and a short video that she made about Trump back in 2016. Even that 11-year-old had a political view that she wanted to share. And then sometimes people will say, well, but, she's just parroting what her parents told her. And we will say to that, in some ways, we're all taking from different sources of inspiration as we think of our political views. But young people, like all of us, are starting to understand their place in relation to politics and what their civic views might be. And so we were looking at social media as a place where a lot of these processes are starting to happen.
Absolutely. And as you note from that example of the 11-year-old, I think she was wearing a Pikachu mask, right? She's in her bedroom and sort of lip syncing a video of Donald Trump lyrics, essentially, to make a political point. And I think that's easy for a lot of people to discount, that youth political expression isn't, it's not serious, it's not objective, maybe it's not rational in this kind of classic political science sense. And for those people, and for some critics, that can make youth political expression somewhat easy to discount, especially because youth may not have a mature stage of cognitive development or not enough real-world experience to make informed political judgments. But you argue that we can still learn valuable insights from studying youth political expression. So what can we learn from these expressions that we might not gain from studying politics in more traditional ways?
Exactly. That's a core argument that we're making in the book, is that, and this is against the atmosphere, this growing panic atmosphere that you were describing before, that youth online political expression is often dismissed or disregarded or looked down upon. But actually, youth use social media in very creative, culturally meaningful ways to explore and to express their political voice. And these ways don't necessarily always fit the traditional civic molds that we're used to, but they're still vital. So a core argument that we make in the book is that traditional political discourse, right, prizes rationality, information, maturity, the sense of detachment and objectivity. And if you think about the latest social media post that you saw on a political topic, it was probably the opposite of that, right? It's probably emotional and it's personal, and it's definitely not necessarily based on facts and rationality and detachment, but that doesn't make it any less significant in our view. So for instance, I don't know, a young person's TikTok lip syncing to a satirical sound clip about reproductive rights may be seen as unserious, or even the example we were talking about before about lip syncing that Trump speech, but it signals strong emotional engagement and political positioning, right? So we pay close attention to these modes of expression because they tell us a lot about what kind of issues young people care about, how they frame them, and then how they really creatively, imaginatively engage with politics through things like cultural references, like humor. And we believe strongly that these are increasingly important in today's digital public sphere, and to not pay attention to them or dismiss them or look down upon it is a big mistake. And ultimately, it doesn't pay justice and respect to youth voice.
And I'll just add to that yes, we have this expectation that politics should be serious and objective and rational, and we use that as a criterion to judge young people's expression. But we should also be seriously asking ourselves, both is our own expression serious, objective, and rational? And even if we look at politicians and political opinion leaders, is their expression serious and objective and rational? And usually we'll find that the answer is no. So why are we setting a higher standard for the expression of young people who are still playing with their creative voice, trying to find it and trying to match it to what's called the platform vernacular, right? So the different forms of expression that are unique to each platform. And that's one of the reasons that those forms of expression look the way they do and why they're quite different from maybe what we imagine as the politics of the past. But really, it's quite often an imagination, more an ideal than the actual reality.
Yeah, and I think one thing that, this is probably more of a comment than a question, but one thing that I found particularly compelling in your argument was that, we kind of set these voting ages of 18, or in some countries it's 16. And so these youth are actually sort of barred from what we consider the more serious forms of participation, like voting. And so in that sense, youth political expression is really the only mechanism they have to influence the system, because they're sort of deprived at that age of other types of behaviors that actually impact policy. So in some sense, this is all they really have. And in that case, maybe it's a bit more important than for someone over 18 who has both the rights and abilities to express, but also to vote as well.
Right. So I think in general, scholars of political science and sometimes political communication, in our perspective, sometimes may put too much stress on voting as sort of, the main or the key civic act. Of course, it is a highly important civic act, but we also know that all of us also have other ways to express our politics. And if we will only vote, often that will not be enough within the context of participatory democracy to really make sure our voices are heard. But yes, I agree that for young people, it's especially the case because they don't have the right to vote and they can't express their voice in that way. And in that context, for example, we as researchers would be highly critical of, say, the decision that was made in Australia to bar young people from social media use until the age of 16. Because we think about examples of activists that we know who are 12 and 13 and 14 and 15-year-olds who use their social media very strategically as a way to enact their activism. So taking away their social media use is actually another way of taking away their voice.
Definitely. And I mean, on the one hand, youth have always had the opportunity to express their political voice, but it's sort of really changed with the media environment and the various ways and sort of, digitally mediated features that youth can do this. I'm thinking about things like stitching on TikTok, things that we couldn't have even imagined 10 years ago. And to help make sense of the various ways that this expression can happen, you developed the Norms, Affordances, Contents framework to study these expressions across different media. So could you walk us through this framework and explain how it helps to reveal how culture, media, and agency can interact to shape political discourse?
Sure, I'll get us started on this. So yes, one of the arguments we make in our book is that when we're thinking about young people's political expression, in many ways, the how matters to them almost as much sometimes as the what. So the form of expression is sometimes as important as the content of expression. And they pay a lot of attention to the ways that they structure their forms of expression. So depending on the platform, this may be things like choice of audio that will be in the background, choice of editing, who you do it with, what kind of expression genres you use in terms of humor and referencing popular culture, and so on. And as we were trying to analyze these, we also had a theoretical aim. Our theoretical aim was to provide a framework that helps to analyze or to make sense of why it is that different platforms shape political expression in different ways, or really shape any expression in different ways. That is why a political video that's posted, say, on TikTok or on Instagram or on YouTube would feel and look very differently, even though in all cases it might be a political video. And that's what we try to do with our norms affordances contents framework. Ioana, would you like to describe the framework a little bit?
Sure. So we're not the first, obviously, to theorize these three elements as being really crucial for political expression or even for expression online more broadly. But we're really making an argument here around their intersection and the particular ways in which their intersection in youth-focused online spaces shape the kind of political expression that happens there. So starting with norms, we know that each platform cultivates its own kind of behavioral expectations, right? So for instance, Instagram values aesthetic cohesion, the sense of curated authenticity, which shapes how you frame political messages, as we analyze in our case study that was focused on Instagram and Black Lives Matter, more specifically the murder of Breonna Taylor. So for instance, a user that wants to speak to this topic might post an infographic that matches their feed's color palette and the kind of aesthetic norms of Instagram, embedding activism in this broader identity project. Then the second part of the framework is affordances, which are not just technical features, right? It drives me nuts when my students sometimes use features and affordances interchangeably. So I always call this out, right? They're not just technical features, but perceived action possibilities. And so it's a very user-centric concept. And we argue that young people use platform affordances creatively, right? So for instance, thinking of TikTok or Musically in our case study, how the duet function really enables direct engagement and this sense of layered commentary that is more than just the existence of the feature itself, but rather what it gives the user, what it affords the user. And then last but not least, but perhaps maybe the most straightforward part of our framework is content. And that really relates to what you see on the platform and significantly what the algorithm really enables you to see, right? Because all of this is algorithmically determined. And then, of course, there's an extra arrow there going from contents to norms, because the contents that you see reinforces what you believe in terms of the norms, right? It reinforces what kind of political expression you think is okay on the platform and is actually appealing on the platform. And I will also add, just to further complicate things, we believe that this is a meso level framework. So it's really at the platform level. But of course, there's a lot of other complicating factors that happen both kind of below and above it. So both at the micro level, the level of the individual, and at the macro level, the level of the society. So things like the degree of polarization, freedom of expression, etc., that all shape what can and does happen at the meso level. Said we could be a little geeky, so there it is.
No, definitely. And I think for those of us working in this space, we know that it's such a jungle. There's more platforms, more cases of things happening on different platforms. And so we need these type of frameworks to try to make sense of what's going on across these various platforms. And so in the book, you have 3 cases of political content on 3 different platforms that you mentioned: Musically, which was kind of the precursor to TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. So could you explain a bit the rationale behind the cases you chose to focus on for the book, both in terms of the content studied, but also the platforms themselves?
Yeah, I'll be very happy to talk about that. It was an interesting process of trying to decide both about the platforms and which case study to choose for each one of them. And I also connect to that a point that I wanted to make also about that arrow that Ioana mentioned from content to norms, which also gives space to how these platforms and the norms that they have about political expression can change over time. So soon I'll talk about Instagram, which is one of our platforms of interest. Instagram, for example, is one of these platforms that used to be much less political. So it was seen much more as a platform, for leisure and beautiful pictures of the beach and maybe my cocktail that I'm drinking on the beach and so on. And increasingly around 2020, we saw it become more politicized. And so as we see more political content, that also shapes our norms or what we perceive as being normative on the platform. So that brings us to our platforms and our cases. So I'll start with the first one, Musical.ly. If you don't know what Musical.ly is, it's because it doesn't exist anymore. Today we know it as TikTok. But back around the US election of 2016, it was a smaller, more niche app called Musical.ly. And there we studied the US elections. So very strictly like partisan party politics. We looked at Trump supporters, and you would say Clinton supporters, but really was Trump supporters versus Trump opposers. Looking at hashtag Make America Great Again versus hashtag Not My President. And Musical.ly was small enough that at the time we were able to qualitatively analyze all the public Musical.ly posts that use these two central hashtags. Today, if we were using TikTok, we would, of course, have to sample maybe, I don't know, 0.5% of that or less than that. So that's chapter 3 of the book. For chapter 4, we took Instagram, the very visually oriented platform that really puts stress on a visual representation that is often quite ideal, let's say, things that are very pretty, that are very aesthetic. It is supposed to look very nice and to be very visually appealing. But we chose a case there that doesn't really work with that theoretically, because we chose Black Lives Matter. And specifically, we talk about the police murder of Breonna Taylor and hashtag Justice for Breonna. And so really that chapter looks at that tension. How do you do that? How do you represent a difficult topic like police violence against a Black female victim within a platform that focuses on ideal visual representation? And we talk about how users negotiate that, for example, by posting pictures of Breonna Taylor that look like they belong on Instagram, but then pairing those with text about the injustice that happened to her and how you can take action by contacting your political representatives and so on. And then chapter 5 deals with YouTube, which sometimes we don't think of as a social media platform because some adults maybe will use YouTube just to like look up a video. But for many young people, it is a social media platform. They follow people, they comment on there, they have people following them, they create content and so on. And on YouTube, we wanted to focus on climate change as a large topic. And specifically, we look at climate anxiety. So young people's concerns that the climate deterioration actually leads to mental well-being problems among young people or anxiety among young people. So we don't diagnose anyone, but we look at the discourse around that term of climate anxiety. And on YouTube, we saw very different kinds of videos. Videos we saw there were much, much longer. They went much more in depth into the topic of climate change. So we had, like a 50-minute video where maybe a 15-year-old together with her mother are having a book club around a climate-related book. And interestingly, some of these very long form videos, or maybe it's not that surprisingly, also had very small reach. So sometimes we would analyze artifacts that maybe reached like 4 or 5 views. And that was interesting to understand and think about these trade-offs. And why did we choose that in general? We tried to use the platforms that are most popular with young people around these demographics that are oriented towards young people, right? Because we know that Facebook, young people don't see it as their space. They might use it, but they mostly use it to communicate with adults. And in terms of political topics, we wanted to go from sort of the mainstream party politics towards something that's more around, let's say, identity politics or racial politics. And then moving on to climate change as a more globally oriented topic with global repercussions and implications. Our climate change chapter is also the one that's most international in terms of our participants there. So that gives you sort of a brief overview and hopefully a teaser for some of the chapters that might be interesting for people to look at.
Right. And of course, each chapter has its own set of more granular findings that you'll have to read the book to find out. But yeah, I really appreciate that spread of different cases. But as you were alluding to, with the YouTube example, sometimes these posts may not have the largest reach, but they still serve some function for the people who are participating in this type of expression on these various platforms. And so could you share with us how these different platforms have different functions for the people using them across these various political contexts?
Yes, definitely. And I think Neta's overview was really great. And I will add, just from a writing perspective or from a research design perspective, even, it was a really interesting process that we engaged in together in trying to come up with these case studies. It felt like the stakes were really high when we wanted to make this larger argument about political expression. So then what kind of case studies would be most helpful and most fitting? And I think Neta did such a great job of explaining why we chose these, both in terms of their popularity with youth, the different kind of topics that they provided a lens into, right? So everything from institutional politics to then political topics around identity, and then a truly global, very Gen Z specific political topic of climate change. And also this kind of move from the local to the localized or national with global implications, and then to the quintessentially global, right? So moving from US presidential elections to Black Lives Matter to climate change. And we also included a methodological appendix at the end of the book that explains these choices in more detail, that also explains the research design for each of the case studies and the methodological choices and dilemmas that we grappled with in doing this empirical work for each of the case studies. So if your listeners are interested, we definitely recommend this methodological appendix, which we hope is a useful guide for researchers that are doing this kind of work or that would like to tread into doing this kind of work. But to answer your question more specifically about the functions that we saw in terms of studying these three platforms, I would say that Musical.ly functioned as a space for symbolic, highly referential, and kind of trend-based expression. The politics that we saw there were effective, very personal, often humorous. As we saw in the example that we talked about at the beginning, young people, for instance, expressing disillusionment with political leaders and with institutional politics by lip syncing to ironic audio clips or using performative satire as a kind of civic critique. For Instagram, like Neta beautifully explained, it fostered a kind of aesthetic mode of activism where users built these visual narratives that merged identity and everyday life with advocacy, often using these aestheticized images, image carousels. And then for YouTube, it encouraged deeper political, you could even call it political storytelling, right? Political storytelling, commentary, reflection. And it functioned as a global space for political discussion around quintessentially global topic, where young people use their emotions really to make these broader political arguments, but also to connect with like-minded others. So in this case, it really functioned as a space of not only political expression, but peer-to-peer support or mutual support around this very significant challenge that young people are dealing with across the world.
Yeah, I think what struck me was exactly these kind of different functions that these platforms have. And those could be related to the cases themselves, but maybe, in some cases, certain platforms serve certain needs for users depending on the context. And so it just gets sort of complex in terms of the realities of how young people are using all these various platforms. And that brings up the question, well, how do we interpret this in the broader context of democracy? And the book helps answer this question through the concept of expressive citizenship, which can be seen as an expectation for how good citizens should act. And that might sound a little bit abstract. So, for our listeners who are not familiar with citizenship models, could you introduce us to what those are and how you came to the conceptualization of expressive citizenship as a form of a democratic model?
Sure, happy to talk about that. So I'll start off by saying that we had three aims for our book, and so far we touched on two of them. The first was a descriptive aim, showing what youth political expression on these platforms looks and feels like, and I think we touched on this. And the second was a theoretical aim around platforms, so to talk about how different platforms shape political expression. And now this really brings us to our third aim, which is a normative aim of asking whether the kinds of expression that we see are good for democracy and in what way. And really that was our main impetus for writing this book in the first place, because we're not interested in youth political expression just because, it's trendy and it's colorful. At the end of the day, what we're interested in is the health of democracies and how young people are becoming part of democratic citizenry. And so we really care about this question. Like, is this kind of expression, it's fun, it's creative, it's colorful, but is it good for democracy? So we grappled a lot with how to answer this question. And the way we came to answer it is really through this concept of expressive citizenship as a citizenship model. So quickly, citizenship models, what are they and what do we mean by them? A citizenship model is sort of the idea we have in our head about who is the good citizen, what should a good citizen do, and how should they behave. And those who've maybe read a little bit about citizenship models are probably familiar with, say, Lance Bennett's ideas about the dutiful citizen versus self-actualizing citizen, where the dutiful citizen, she or he, they vote and they pay taxes and they do sort of like institutional politics versus, self-actualizing citizens will maybe try to express their voice or maybe like spy based on their ideology. And so we really build on this very important work, but we say that the expression we saw throughout the book takes it a step further to the citizenship model we describe or we call expressive citizenship. And we say that according to expressive citizenship, a good citizen is one who speaks out on social media about things that they see, things that happen, things that matter in the world, and that is first of all, a form of political participation that matters in and of itself, not only because maybe it will lead to maybe protest in the street or to voting, but in and of itself, it matters. And not only does it matter, in some cases, it may be normatively expected. So someone who has, an expressive citizenship model in sort of their head would say, okay, something big is happening right now. You have to be expressing yourself about it. You have to be posting about it on social media. And if you're not, then maybe you're not a good citizen. In terms of the empirical cases in our book, Black Lives Matter in the US in 2020 is a very strong example of that. That was sort of a time where people felt that something very big is happening and everyone should be expressing themselves about it. And if they're not, then maybe they're not being a good citizen. And so this sort of idea lies behind a lot of the expression that we see throughout the book. And it then helps us do the next stage of ask, okay, but is expressive citizenship good for democracy or not?
Yeah, and to be honest, in chapter 6, which is the final chapter of our book, we really struggled with this question and what the stakes of expressive citizenship are. And even the question of what is good political expression online, right? When we're talking about the normative aim and normative aspects, it implies that there is a standard of what is good, right? And that's actually a really complex and spiny question to answer. And it involves two things. One, defining what is good political expression online. And then the second part is making an argument as to how we make that happen or how we bridge what is currently happening with these normative ideals. And for the first part, in just the definitional work, Ultimately, our argument, the argument that we put forward in this final chapter is that maybe there is not one model of good political expression, but perhaps two. And this is building on the significant work of Diana Mutz on these models and identifying two different, but not mutually exclusive necessarily, models of good political expression. One is the discursive model, and one is the mobilizational model. So when we're talking about discursive aims, the aim is to talk to those that are different from you, to heterogeneous others, and to be able to have an open, engaged, constructive dialogue, to build tolerance, to listen to other people's perspective. And that's a very worthwhile aim that unfortunately is increasingly hard to attain in today's political moment. But there's also the mobilizational aim, and that is, it doesn't have to do with connecting with those that don't hold the same political expression, but rather connecting with like-minded others. So the point is not necessarily to talk to those that you disagree with or to try to change anybody's mind or to enter these constructive debates, but rather to get together with those that agree with you and make things happen. And, this obviously plays into activism and social action. And if we draw the line and we think about expressive citizenship and we think about the function and the potential of social media and political life today, we believe that, for better or worse, it is better at supporting this mobilizational model and supporting mobilizational aims than supporting discursive.
Right. And thinking back, I think we've seen some examples in key events, whether it comes to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and people expressing their feelings there and kind of prompting Western governments to act. But also here in Scandinavia, we had a recent case of J.D. Vance and his wife visiting Greenland. And there was such an outrage on social media that it sort of diverted their plans and made them change course. So I could definitely see how this idea of expressing through social media can have, more implications than just voicing your opinion. But I was also thinking about how we've sort of seen this decline in organic posting over time, where people across all ages seem to be posting less in public spaces, whereas the content creation is kind of centering around people who are trying to make a hobby or a living out of this in terms of content creators. So I'm just wondering how you see expressive citizenship against those sort of macro level trends of people feeling less comfortable posting out their opinions online for others to see.
Sure. So I'll start off by talking about, sort of the nature of events that trigger expectations of expressive citizenship, because you're right to identify it's not every event, not everyone has the idea that everyone should post about, let's say, a certain esoteric decision that was made in certain parliament today, but rather it's sort of these big issues that also usually capture media attention and everyone's talking about them. That's when there are these expectations of expressive citizenship. And that's actually something we also figured out as we were going with this argument. And now moving to your question about, do people post less publicly on social media and prefer more like, let's say, direct messages? I'll get to it from several angles. First of all, I'll share some of parallel work that I've been doing with my colleague, Ori Tenenbaum. And Ori and I have been conceptualizing the idea of meso new spaces. So these are spaces, digital spaces that lie between the public and the private. So they're not in sort of like public facing social media like Ioana and I analyzed in this book, but they're also not private one-to-one communication. So examples could be a large WhatsApp group or a Facebook group that's private. And we definitely, in some contexts, see communication that moves to some of these in-between spaces, which are tricky because they're often tricky for researchers to study. There are often ethical concerns in studying them. Those are some of the things we discuss in that meso new space work. But that said, I do think that there's still a lot of bottom-up expression of everyday people and everyday citizens that is going on. And young people, as we said, because they don't have that many ways to act in public ways, having a voice on social media is really a form of expression that matters for them very much. And I'm not sure, I'd have to still look at data, but I'm not sure that activists do that less. So yes, it's true that there's content creators who are, making a living from that. And there's also, political online creators, right? Or political influencers or influencers who are cultural influencers, but also use their voice for politics. And that's a separate, interesting phenomena. Ioana and my interest tends to be more in the organic, everyday users, and we still see them. We still see them as having a voice. We still find their voices on social media, even though it's not everyone's voice.
Yes, and I would add, I think the larger social political movements also matter here, even in terms of what's going on in the United States and how, students are being advised to scrub their social media history, or people that are coming into the US are asked to consider what they post on social media and how that can be scrutinized by authorities. So I think that also probably plays into these dynamics as well. Then on the other hand, there's also, in specific context, a sense of exhaustion sometimes, and overload with politics and political expression. For instance, one of my doctoral students, Abu Abdelbagi, is doing research on political expression and media literacy in Sudan. And one of his findings is that Sudanese youth are just so emotionally overwhelmed right after so many years and even decades of political conflict, and that everything they see on the news, it has to do with the war and with violence, and that they tend to both consume less and post less just because of this sense of overwhelm. So I think that's also a really real situation that is real and raw in so many places in the world right now, including in places that we never would have expected are in this situation.
Right. But I think in that sense, it also does help bring some validity to the model, because citizenship should require some type of effort, right? It does require some type of expenditure of whether that's emotional energy or resource expenditure. And I think that if the sort of stakes to express are high, then in a sense that helps to prove out the point that citizenship requires action and requires care. It shouldn't be something that's too low resource, I think.
Yes, I love this point, and it's a point that is really important to us and dear to our heart. I think in the final empirical chapter on YouTube, this was definitely a conclusion that emerged, and that yes, political expression is taxing emotionally, cognitively, effectively, really. And so when we idealize youth online political expression, this idea that, oh, the kids are all right and will be fine because youth activists are out there doing the good work and the important work. We are putting a lot on the shoulders of young people, and activism and advocacy and speaking out really does come with a price. So thank you. Thank you for foregrounding that important argument.
You're welcome. And I have one last question for you here, kind of connecting back to the idea of socialization that we started out with. And, perhaps it's too simply put, but classically, the idea of socialization is that you kind of form your identity during adolescence and then that stays with you over time. But when we have youth expressing themselves and kind of experimenting with their political identity at a young age, thinking long term, what do you think the implications of that might be? Will we have sort of different values of citizenship for different generations? Or as the media landscape changes, are there any potential risks of having people who, because they were socialized differently, have different understandings of citizenship? Or how do you see the sort of long-term implications of people experimenting with their identities in different media environments?
So I tend to be very cautious about predicting into the future. I feel like the last years have been so, surprising and unexpected in so many ways that it makes us very modest. But still, I'd say, at least when we're looking to the past, I think we sometimes tend to exaggerate generational differences. And, there's always this recurring story of, young people today are so different, from older generations. And we see that, some of that also changes as they grow up and as, they go into different roles of being parents themselves and, working full time and, having a mortgage or whatever. So some things change that way. And yes, there's still definitely the formative effect of the experiences of youth and the media they experienced then. But I would say that if we have fragmented understandings today, I think they're not so much around the generational lines and more really about political lines. So, what keeps me up at night is less the rifts between young people and older people, and more, political polarization, but one that is not just caused by social media or bottom up, but one that is often strategically, even like I would say, engineered by politicians who are using it for their political capital and are using social media as part of that. So I think for me, that is the more concerning fragmentation around understanding of politics than the generational one. I don't know, Ioana, how do you see that?
Yeah, it's a good final question, because one spectrum that we've been grappling with in the book is, do we still consider ourselves optimists, right? Studying the things that we study and thinking about the future. And in the final chapter, we talk a little bit about this, not only from our identity as researchers, but also as mothers, as politically engaged citizens, as educators, right? All these different hats that we wear. And I would say that still, despite the recent challenges that we've experienced politically, both locally and nationally and worldwide, I'm still cautiously optimistic, or maybe critically hopeful, that I do think it's good that in today's environment, online environments, political socialization is increasingly informal and peer-oriented and culturally mediated. I think it's good that young people are not necessarily waiting for institutions to teach them about politics, but they're actually learning it kind of hands-on through participation, through engagement in these everyday digital spaces that they inhabit. Going back to what we were saying at the beginning of the conversation about how this enables them to experiment with voice, to develop civic norms, to situate themselves in relation to these broader publics. But yes, it also raises some important challenges, and the fragmented nature of these environments means that civic norms are not necessarily held in common or evenly distributed. They can be empowering in some spaces or exclusionary or misinforming in others. It's also really important to acknowledge that this can also be shaped, and political leaning, really, political stances can be shaped by platform algorithms and peer dynamics, right, rather than by deliberation or participation in itself. But despite these complexities, I think I take this critically hopeful stance. So rather than, I don't know, mourning this absence of a shared civic script or civic norms, I would say there's potential in the emergence of multiple civic imaginaries or civic imaginations, which is a concept that we take from our dear advisor, PhD advisor, Henry Jenkins, with each reflecting different values and ways of knowing and expressive styles.
Yes, I definitely share your hesitation in trying to predict the future, but I think one thing we can say is that there will be new forms of political expression that we cannot see yet. So I think it's fantastic to have a look into these various platforms and the different ways that youth are expressing their political identities online. So Dr. Kligler-Vilenchik, Dr. Literat, thanks so much for taking the time out and sharing your research with us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
I've just been speaking with Dr. Neta Kligler-Vilenchik, Associate Professor of Communication and Journalism at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and Dr. Ioana Literat, Associate Professor in the Communication, Media, and Learning Technologies Design Program at Teachers College, Columbia University. Check out the episode description for a link to the book we've been discussing in this episode. And that's a wrap for this episode of the Social Media and Politics podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. For those of you tuning in when the episode drops, happy Easter, and I hope you have some sun wherever you are. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, signing off from Elmo. See you next time.